Biggest Parsha Naso, and obviously Parsha Naso is the longest Parsha, and it has a couple of interesting themes going throughout the Parsha. So we'll go through the themes quickly, and then we'll specifically speak about Sotah and Nazir. The beginning of the Parsha discusses the Levium, the counting of the Levium. So if you remember Parshas Bamidbar last week, the Levium were divided into the Jewish people were counted last week. The Levium were counted separately. The Levium were counted in three different family groups, Gershon, Kehath, and Merari, and they were counted separately. As we mentioned in Bamidbar, one of the themes of Bamidbar is commandments associated with the temple, the Mishkan, or ritual purity. And therefore, the Chumash, the Parsha of Naso continues with the commandment to remove from the Jewish community those that have certain types of tumas, certain types of impurities. And of course, we also discuss the use of temple vessels or temple funds inappropriately and how to rectify such a sin. The next subject, is what I want to speak about in more detail, is Sotah. Sotah is a man who suspects his wife of adultery. And we'll go through that in a moment. Sotah is followed by Nazir. For those of us who have learned Sotah, we're familiar with Sotah and Nazir being two Talmudical tractates that are right next to each other. And the Talmud explains that's because Sotah and Nazir and the Chumash are actually written right next to each other. Nazir follows Sotah. What is a Nazir? A Nazir is somebody who wants to become holy. What does he do? He has three restrictions. Number one, he can't eat grapes or drink wine. Number two, he can't cut his hair. And number three, he can't become tummy. He can't be an undertaker, can't go to a funeral. At the conclusion of his vow, which is typically 30 days, he cuts his hair and he brings a bunch of karbonos, sacrifices, and he ends his Naziris. Following Nazir, we discuss Birchas Kehanim, the priestly blessings. Interestingly enough, the details of Birchas Kehanim are actually discussed in the tractate of Sotah. And then the Torah teaches us the exact verses of the blessing, which is the verses that we say today, V'rech Hashem v'yishmerecha, etc. And finally, the end of the Parsha, which is a large chunk, details the gift, really the commissioning of the Mishkan. And when the Mishkan was commissioned, the head of each of the 12 tribes gave a gift of the karbonos, the sacrifices, and each set of karbonos for each of the tribal leaders is enumerated separately and listed separately. And that takes up the end of the Parsha. So I want to discuss today a little bit about Sotah and Nazir. I'll try to explain what it is and maybe ask some questions. What is a Sotah? A Sotah is a woman who's suspected of adultery. It's a very interesting name, the word Sotah. What does the word Sotah mean? There's two explanations. The Talmud explains that it reflects the nature of adultery. The nature of adultery requires that a shtus, a foolishness, enter into someone's mind. In other words, the Talmud is teaching is typically adultery is not a calculated, methodical sin, but adultery typically reflects a certain amount of foolishness, and that foolishness results, or eventually it results in the sin of adultery itself. Rashi says the simple explanation is because the word Sotah, sot means to turn, Sotah means to turn. And Rashi brings a few different sources of where the word Sotah is used in the context of turning. And what does it mean? How did the woman turn? She turned away from the path of modesty. The path of Jewish women is to be modest. And the woman who's a Sotah turned away, and that's why she's called a Sotah. Since her husband suspects her, in other words, her husband's suspicious that she might be engaging in adulterous activity. So what does he do? He warns her in front of witnesses, and he tells her, stay away from this philanderer. There are witnesses that after this warning was given, there are witnesses that see them in seclusion. What does seclusion mean? Such that if they would be together carnally, nobody would know about it. In other words, they're in a locked room, and nobody can enter. They're not in a public place. They're in a private place together. And now the question is, the woman claims she's innocent. She didn't sin with him. But the husband is suspicious. So what does he do? He brings her to the temple. The Kohen requires her first to make an oath, then to bring a sacrifice. We'll talk about that in more detail. And third, she drinks the waters of Sotah. So what happens? She makes an oath that she's innocent and that if she's guilty, She acknowledges that this process will result in her, possibly in her demise. Then she stands there and the Kohen disgraces her while she holds a sacrifice that is made out of barley. By the way, this is one of two sacrifices that are barley. Almost all the other sacrifices are wheat. And then finally, the Kohen takes earth from underneath the temple or the Mishkan. He adds it into a cup of water. This is spring water, which is drawn from the Kiyar, a special vessel. We'll talk about it. And then he takes a parchment that has the curses that God has given a woman who's adulterous, and he erases the parchment with God's name on it into the cup, and she drinks the water. If she's innocent, she bears a child. If she's guilty, she dies. Now, it's very important to know, a woman is not forced to agree to this. She doesn't have to agree to it. She can either admit to sinning, in which case her husband divorces her and his divorce is without penalty. He does not have to pay her anything that he agreed to pay her because it's her fault. Or alternatively, if she says, I'm not drinking at all, she doesn't admit guilt, she also gets divorced without penalty to the husband. But she does not have to admit guilt. She could just say, I'm refusing to drink, and she does not drink. And she suffers no consequence unless separately we have witnesses that actually saw a carnal act. That's a separate discussion, in which case both the man and the woman are both subject to capital punishment. So let's try to explain try to go through some of the unique components of Sotah, and maybe we'll try to raise a few questions that we can address. The Ramban notes something very interesting. He says Sotah is very unique. It's very unique in the sense that it requires miracles. If you think of it, Sotah, if she's innocent, God promises her child. If she's guilty, God promises her demise. The Gemara Talmud says maybe she won't die immediately, but she'll die a death which will originate in the portion of her body that sinned, and it will happen within a year. So there's a miracle. God is promising a miracle here, and the only way that Sotah works is because it is miraculous. Sotah is not natural. There's nothing natural about dying from such a thing. If a person makes this concoction, he won't die from it. And therefore, the question is, why Sotah? Why is Sotah so unique that it requires God's miraculous intervention in order for the Sotah process to work? What's the explanation of that? Why is Sotah? What's so unique about Sotah that it merits this requirement of miracles? Obviously, the Talmud points out over here that if people are not stringent in the laws of erva, of forbidden relationships, then they don't do Sotah anymore. Sotah is only when the community, the congregation, the Jewish people as a whole are on a high moral level, then Sotah works. Otherwise, they don't even perform the Sotah ritual. Now that's sort of understandable because the ritual requires a miracle. You have to be on a certain spiritual level to demand a miracle from God. But it needs explanation. Why is it that Sotah is the example the Torah gives as as something that it requires God's intervention. Secondly, if the woman is innocent, she merits a child here. Now, there's a question here. What does it mean she's innocent? She's not innocent. She's never innocent. It may be that she was in seclusion with another man and did not sin with her. However, that only reflects part of the story. Hold on a second. This woman, her husband said, stay away from this guy. And she went ahead and locked herself in a room for 10 minutes with the guy. And then she walks out and says, I'm innocent. You're not innocent. You violated the laws of Yichud. You violated the laws of being in seclusion with a man. And not only that, you were warned. You were told specifically not to do it. Your husband said to you, don't be with this man. And you went and did it anyway. So even if you might be innocent of a carnal crime, but the difficulty here is, what does it mean she's innocent? She merits a child. She's not innocent. She's never innocent. There's always some amount of guilt. She's always engaged in questionable behavior. Try to go a little further. Bring another point. We said Rashi explains the reason of a Sotah. Why is she called a Sotah? Because she turned away from the path of modesty. Jewish women are modest. She turns away. Now hold on a second. Immodesty, there's sort of a gap between immodesty and adultery. They're not exactly the same thing. And yet a woman who's a suspected adulterer is called turned away from the path of modesty. Why is that the title? Why is this the title of a woman who's a Sotah? Moreover, we'll ask another question. The Talmud says a woman who's a Sotah, she is treated as a certain adulterer until she drinks the water. Once she drinks the water, if she stays alive, then we say she's permitted to her husband. She's not an adulterer. Now, let's say a person has a piece of meat. It might be kosher. It might be non-kosher. There's a set of halachas, there's a set of laws that tells us how to govern this interaction. In other words, do we treat it as kosher? What happens if somebody ate it by mistake? How do we treat it? In no case do we treat it as certainly non-kosher. Now, Sotah is a suffix. It's a doubt. Why is a Sotah treated as a certain adulterer unless we know otherwise? What's the explanation of that? The Zohar has an interesting question. The Kohen, he epitomizes kindness. He epitomizes spiritual elevation, forgiveness. The sacrifices were elevating the people. The Kohen was the representative to try to inspire the people to tshuva, to repentance, to returning to God. And yet over here, the Kohen is sort of the judge and the jury and the executioner, sort of. He gets up and he tells her she's going to be cursed if she's guilty. And then if she is guilty, she dies. The Zohar wonders, how could the Kohen, that's the epitome of kindness and spiritual elevation, how is it that he could be judging a woman and condemning her to death? Sotah is right next to Nazir. A Nazir is called holy. Kadesh Yeh, he's a holy person. What makes him holy? So you think to be holy, you have to be ascetic, you have to go into the forest and meditate. Maybe some sort of sexual restrictions would be appropriate. How does the Torah say you become holy? Very simple. You do three things which are relatively minor. One of them is a restriction of avoiding wine and grapes, not cutting your hair, and not going to funerals. And again, the typical length of a Naziris is 30 days. It's a nice thing, but it doesn't seem that's sort of the definition of holiness. This is how a Jew becomes holy. God calls him a holy person by sort of engaging in restrictions that most people, not most, but many people often have a month in which they don't drink wine. They don't cut their hair and they don't go to funerals unless you're Jewish, of course, and you're drinking wine every week. But other than that, there are people that drink just wine for Kiddush, and that's it. The Talmud relates that the Nazir is written after the story of Sotah. Why? Because somebody who witnesses a Sotah, he should become a Nazir. Now, the simple explanation is very easy. It's that often promiscuity is a result of excessive alcohol consumption. And therefore, the smart idea is somebody sees a Sotah, he should recognize, alcohol is a dangerous drug. Be careful with your alcohol. But perhaps there's something deeper going on here. Something that relates why wine, specifically, of all three restrictions of Nazir, is specifically related to Sotah and the concept of being holy, of being a Kadosh. So I'll try to explain a little bit. It would seem very fair, given a little bit of notice here. Most of what I'm saying here is from the Shem Shmuel, that's the Rebbe of Sochachav. The basic idea he quotes from his father, which was the Avnei Nezer. He says, obviously, Sotah is not about killing a suspected adulteress, because she doesn't have to agree to the Sotah process. She doesn't need to agree. She could just say, no, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. She doesn't even have to admit guilt. If she refuses to participate, that's fine. It's perfectly acceptable. She's under no obligation to participate in this process. She decides to participate in it. She wants to declare her innocence. And therefore, says the Avnei Nezer, it must be that Sotah is not about killing a suspected adulteress, but rather, Sotah is about a spiritual elevation for a woman who's innocent. That's the idea. We'll explain it. Okay, let's begin for the basics. The Talmud in Sotah relates that if a husband and wife live together in harmony, God's presence rests among them. And the explanation for this is as follows. The Hebrew word for a male is ish, and isha for a woman. The word ish and isha are spelled the same way. Ish and Isha both have the letters of Aleph and Shin together. And Isha has a Yud. Ish has a Yud, Isha has a Hey. The word Ish for a male is Aleph Yud Shin. The word Isha for a female is Aleph Shin Hey. So again, they have the letters of Aleph Shin together. Both male and female have the letters of Aleph and Shin. And yet the male has the letter Yud and the female has the letter Hey. The letters of Yud and the letter Hey is God's name. We don't pronounce the name, so when we're not saying the prayers, and therefore we call it Ka, even though it's not pronounced that, it's obviously spelled Yud and then Hey. And therefore, if a couple live together in harmony, you have the combination of God's name inside the words of male and female, Ish and Isha. Now, what happens if they don't have harmony? So then you remove God's presence from the marriage. What are you left with? Aleph and Shin. Aleph and Shin spell the word Ish, or fire. And a sort of a fire consumes the marriage. So we begin by understanding this letter of Yud and Hey, God's name of Ka, it's God's presence that rests inside the marriage. But it's more than that. The verse states, Ki v'ka Hashem tzor elamim. God created the world with the name of Ka. God uttered the word Ka and he fashioned the world. Not only did he fashion this world, but he fashioned the heavenly spiritual worlds as well. The Medrash says, how did God create the world with the name of Ka? He took the world, as the verse states in the beginning of Bereshis, right in the beginning of Genesis. It says that the world was water. God's presence was floating on the water. And God revealed the land. The Medrash says, how did he reveal the land? He took earth from underneath his throne. He put the earth in the water. And through that, God revealed the dry land. And the Kabbalists relate which name is the name of Ka. The name of Ka is the name that's in the hidden worlds. The name of Ka sort of animates the world that we live in, but it itself remains hidden. And that's why we say, Ki v'ka Hashem tzor elomim. God creates two worlds with the name of Ka. This world and the hidden world that animates this world. So let's explain. What happens with Sotah? You have a woman who's suspected of adultery. Voluntarily, she agrees to participate in the Sotah process. What happens? First thing the Kohen does is he takes water. Where's the water pulled from? The water is pulled from the Kiyar. The Kiyar is a vessel in the temple that holds spring water. But there's an interesting facet to this faucet. It's just a faucet, but the cover of the faucet was made with mirrors. Where did they get these mirrors from? So it says the Jewish people in Egypt, the Jewish men were very beaten down, and the Jewish women used to beautify themselves before being with their husbands with these mirrors. And these are the mirrors they donated to beautify the Kiyar, this vessel. So what does the Kiyar represent? The Kiyar represents God's harmony in a marriage. It represents the name of Ka, of God's presence in the marriage, the correct way that a married couple is supposed to live. And then what does he do? What does the Kohen do? Just like when God created the world, he took earth from underneath his throne and put it in the water. The Kohen takes earth from underneath the temple and puts it in the water, drawn from the cup of this Kiyar. And then what does he do? He takes God's name and all the curses that happen if a woman actually committed adultery, and he erases them in the water. What's the Kohen doing? In effect, he's creating a world of spiritual purity. He's taking the word Ka that's been removed from the marriage by the suspicion of adultery here, and he's trying to put it back in. He's trying to have the world experience the hiddenness of God's name. What does that mean? We'll have to explain it. What is the hiddenness of God's name? Why is that the important part of putting back into a woman who's suspected of being adulterous? So like we said, the truth is that a woman who's a suspected Sotah, a woman who's undergoing the process of Sotah, is a suspected adulteress. Even if she didn't actually sin, but she's engaged in problematic behavior. The way she got there was by not listening to her husband's warning and being in seclusion with another man. For that itself, she requires an atonement. Rashi explains, why did she reach that point? In other words, she negated the laws of modesty. She dropped the laws of modesty. She turned away from being modest. Because the job of the Jewish people in this world is to internalize God's presence and to reveal it. And obviously that's pneumistic, that's true and deep and meaningful, could never be fully expressed. And therefore, the Sotah who goes ahead and violates the restrictions of her marriage what she's doing is even if she's completely innocent, even if she was not actually carnally with this other man. What she did was she prostituted herself, her insides. What she did was she violated her own modesty, her own her own meaning, her own spiritual development. And that type of exposure is itself a form of indecency. And that itself needs to have an atonement. And therefore, what she's missing was God's name from a hidden world. In other words, God's name that created the world out of a hidden world. There's something that in every person's soul that's hidden and unique and meaningful and deep. Something that could never be expressed. And this woman, even if she's completely innocent of actually lying carnally with another man, she expressed herself inappropriately by secluding herself against her husband's wishes, or nay, demands, or warning even. By violating her own modesty, she removed God's name from her marriage. And now the Kohen has to put it back in by having her undergo the Sotah process. In other words, what the Kohen is doing here is the Kohen is elevating the woman. It is a spiritual elevation. The spiritual elevation takes place through drinking the waters of Sotah, through putting God's name of Ka back into the marriage, so that she can be with her husband again, so that her husband knows that she's truly innocent. But the only way to do that is to first atone for the fact that she put herself in a compromised situation. Now, in a compromised situation, what happens? There's two ways to look at this event. She's with another man. Either she succumbed to sort of some part of evil, but it isn't who she is. It isn't her identity. She sinned. Unfortunately, she sinned, but she didn't become the sin. She doesn't identify with the sin. There was a moment where she lost her control of her modesty. In that case, then the water purifies her. It removes the stain, and she becomes elevated. If you become elevated with the name of God that created the world, what happens? Of course, what happens is the woman conceives. That's the miraculous part of it. Because you're associating with the name of God that created the world, and that's why the Sotah is a unique commandment that requires God's miraculous intervention. Explain a little bit more. If the woman is guilty, what happens? That it's not just a stain. If she actually sinned with the other man, she actually was with the other man carnally. So then she's taken a sin of immodest exposure, which is the definition of the word Sotah, a lack of modesty, and it's become her identity. And in that case, the stain is washed away with her because she has become the sin, and therefore she dies. But the purpose of drinking the Sotah waters is not to kill her. She doesn't have to drink it. She doesn't have to undergo the process. She can admit guilt or just refuse to participate. But by participating in a spiritually sanctifying experience, it's exactly what a Kohen does. What does a Kohen do? He makes people pure. He brings the sacrifices. He brings tahara. He's making the marriage pure by elevating the woman and reinserting God's name into the marriage. And now, if the woman did not actually sin, so then it purifies her and it removes the sin of the violation of yichud, being with a man who wasn't her husband, even though they were not carnally together. However, if should she have actually sinned with this other man, so then she's unable to take the spiritual elevation and therefore she dies. It's an interesting point. The sacrifice that's brought is made of barley. Now, where else does a loaf of barley come in? In Tanakh, in the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, we find an interesting event. There was a Gideon, was a prophet and a judge. He went to battle with the Midyanim, the Midianite nation, and God told him to go battle and he's going to win. And God said, if you don't believe me, go out and approach one of the Midyanim tents in secret. You take your assistant with you and listen to what they have to say. So sure enough, Gideon took his assistant. They secretly crept up on one of the Midianite tents, and they started listening to the conversation going on. One of the warriors just woke up from a dream. He had a dream. What did he see in his dream? A loaf of barley. It was flying around, and then eventually it hit a tent. It knocked it over, flipped it upside down, and destroyed it. So the warrior says to his fellow soldier, he says, what does that mean? So the soldier says, it means that God is going to hand us over to Gideon, and we're going to lose the battle. And indeed, that's what happened. Gideon won the war. Says the Ramban, the word barley, which in Hebrew is spelled sa'ira, but if you substitute the sin for a samach, which is known to be done, then it also sa'ara is a storm. And what the offering that the woman brings is sort of a spiritual storm. What she's doing is she's putting herself in a state of heightened spiritual elevation. And if she's able to withstand it, that means her sin will be removed. In other words, the sin of yichud, of violating the norms. If she actually sinned with the man carnally, then she will not be able to take it, and it'll flip over her, and she will die. And that's why Sotah is treated as if it's the sin is certain. We noted in the beginning, we said there are some sins that are certain, some sins that are not. Most of the time, if we have a doubt, we don't treat it as a certainty, except with a suspected adulteress, Sotah. She's treated as if she certainly violated the law. Why? Because she did. She might have not violated the law of being carnally with another man, but she certainly violated the law of not following the appropriate distancing that one should have from sin. She allowed herself to be in seclusion with another man. And that's why she needs to reinvigorate herself with modesty, with a spiritual meaning that she doesn't need to expose herself indecently. And that's by taking the name Ka, the name of Yud and Hey, and putting it back into her marriage, where she can feel a sublime spiritual elevation, which doesn't need to be exposed and become, by that, become indecent. This is the explanation of why Nazir is next to Sotah. What's the explanation of that? Nazir recognizes that distancing oneself from sin, making sure that sin is very far away, is a high priority, and that's what makes a person Jewish. A Jew stays away from sin. Not only does he stay away from sin, but he stays away to the extent that he erects safeguards between him and sin. That's what this woman failed to do, and that's why she became a Sotah. And that's why a Nazir is going to become Kaddish. She's going to become holy. How does he become holy? He stays away from wine. In Mishlei, in Proverbs, Shlomo HaMelech teaches, King Solomon writes, Nichnas yayin yatzasayit. When the wine goes in, the secret comes out, as they say in English, colloquially. What does that mean? That means that when a Nazir recognizes he doesn't want his panemius, his internality, his own personal spiritual meaning to be revealed in front of everybody else, as if he's just one of the many drunken people speaking. And therefore he refrains from drinking wine, because he values the spiritual meaning of having a fulfilled, meaningful life. And therefore that suffices to be called a Kaddish. To conclude, what's the message we can take away from it? To be like a Nazir, even though we're not going to become a Nazir. Obviously one should not become a Nazir, but at a basic level, to get the message that a Nazir got. Keep a distance from sin. Recognize that we are a holy nation. Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, are a holy nation, and that by that holiness it requires us to distance ourselves from sin. And through that we should merit to receive the holiness from God, as if we ourselves are Nazirim as well. Thank you.